Singapore's transformation is often framed as destiny, location, timing, leadership. But here's what nobody tells you. Singapore didn't rise because it was lucky. It rose because it was cornered. This is where the pattern begins, not with ambition, but with vulnerability. In 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia with no natural resources, no hinterland, and no security guarantees. Unemployment hovered near 14%. Housing was overcrowded. Communal tensions simmered. For anyone today living in a small economy exposed to global shocks, supply chain risk, or capital flight, the parallel is clear. The question Singapore faced then, and that many nations face now, was brutal. How do you survive when you have nothing to fall back on? The early years were defined by urgency. Singapore's leaders understood something many governments avoid. Sentiment does not substitute for systems. Independence didn't come with prosperity, it came with bills. Food had to be imported. Water depended on agreements. Trade routes could be bypassed. This wasn't an underdog story waiting for inspiration. It was a countdown. At first, the goal wasn't growth. It was credibility. Investors didn't need promises. They needed rules, not ideology. Order. Here's the mechanism. Singapore chose to make itself predictable in an unpredictable region. Corruption was crushed, not tolerated. Courts were enforced, not politicized. Contracts mattered. The civil service was paid competitively to reduce incentives for rent-seeking. These choices weren't popular. They were disciplined. Let me show you exactly how this mattered. In a world of uncertainty, capital flows toward reliability. Singapore didn't compete on size. It competed on trust. At first, it looked like austerity without relief. Wages were restrained. Labor unions were brought under centralized negotiation. Social discipline was emphasized. Everyone thought they were safe if order held. They weren't, unless order translated into opportunity. And this is where the second layer of the pattern emerged. Stability alone doesn't generate growth. It only creates the conditions for it. Singapore leveraged its port first, but didn't stop there. Manufacturing zones were built. Multinational corporations were invited in, not as extractors, but as partners. Tax incentives were paired with workforce training. Education was aligned with industrial needs, not abstract ideals, not consumption. Capability, not slogans, systems. By the early 1970s, exports surged, employment stabilized. The city-state didn't pretend to be self-sufficient. It integrated aggressively into global trade. Here's why this matters. Many countries try to grow first and stabilize later. Singapore reversed the sequence. It built institutions before prosperity, not after. That order is rare and costly up front. Housing programs forced savings through mandatory contributions. Consumption was delayed. Political dissent was tightly managed. At first, it looked like control. Then the bill arrived in the form of rising expectations that demanded results. By the late 1970s, Singapore faced a new risk. Low-cost manufacturing was migrating elsewhere. Wages were rising. The old model was aging fast. Everyone thought the miracle would stall. It didn't, because the system was designed to evolve. The state pushed the economy up the value chain. Finance, logistics, technology, services. Skills were upgraded continuously. This wasn't market spontaneity. It was calibrated adaptation. But success created its own trap. Dependence on global trade deepened. Inequality pressures emerged. Immigration became both an asset and a flashpoint. The danger wasn't what they saw. It was what they ignored. The cost of rigidity in a system built on precision. Singapore had mastered execution. The next challenge was flexibility. And that's where the final question hangs. Can a system designed for discipline adapt without losing coherence? Can a hub built on trust absorb volatility without fracture? Singapore's rise wasn't inevitable. It was engineered under pressure. Whether that engineering can continue indefinitely is the unresolved tension at the heart of its story. Singapore's system didn't just create growth. It created momentum that fed on itself. Here's what nobody tells you. Once a hub succeeds, it becomes responsible for managing its own gravity. Capital, talent, and trade didn't just pass through Singapore. They began to accumulate. This is where the pattern deepens, from survival to orchestration. By the 1980s and 1990s, Singapore had become a critical node in global finance, shipping, and manufacturing. GDP per capita surged from under $1,000 in the 1960s to over $30,000 by the early 2000s. At first, it looked like a miracle. Then, the bill arrived. Here's the mechanism. Growth was not left to chance. The state coordinated savings, housing, education, and infrastructure as a single system. Mandatory savings funded both retirement and public investment. Public housing anchored social stability while preventing speculative spirals early on. Education pipelines were adjusted continuously to meet economic needs, not welfare. Alignment, not redistribution. Incentives. This structure allowed Singapore to scale without chaos, but it also reduced room for error. As Singapore integrated deeper into global flows, dependence increased. Trade volumes dwarfed domestic demand. External shocks, financial crises, pandemics, geopolitical tension carried outsized impact. Analysts suggest this exposure is the price of hub status. You gain relevance, but lose insulation. Some economists argue that Singapore's resilience comes from redundancy, diverse trade partners, fiscal buffers, and rapid policy response. Others point out that precision systems can become brittle if assumptions shift too quickly. This is the trap. Systems optimized for efficiency must constantly reinvest in adaptability. The danger wasn't collapse, it was complacency. Rising inequality tested social cohesion, high costs strained younger generations. Immigration became a pressure valve and a political fault line. Everyone thought stability was permanent. It wasn't guaranteed. The state responded by recalibrating, slowing inflows, expanding social support, investing in technology and automation. Not panic, adjustment, not reversal, refinement. If this pattern applies elsewhere, Singapore's story carries a warning alongside its inspiration. You cannot skip stages. Credibility must precede capital. Institutions must precede innovation. And discipline must be paired with evolution. Some analysts suggest that attempts to replicate Singapore fail because they copy outcomes instead of sequences. Ports without trust. Financial hubs without legal credibility. Growth strategies without social buy-in. The result is fragility disguised as ambition. Here's why this matters now. Many cities and countries want to become hubs in a fragmented global economy. Singapore shows that hubs are not declared. They are built through decades of consistent choices. And once built, they demand constant maintenance. The same system that creates advantage can lock in dependency if it stops adapting. Singapore turned from a vulnerable port city into a global hub, not by betting on scale, but by mastering reliability. Not size. Precision. Not abundance. Design. The lesson isn't that discipline guarantees success. It's that without discipline, success never compounds. And the final tension remains unresolved. In a world growing more volatile, can a system built on control stay flexible without losing trust? Singapore's rise answers one question decisively: how to build a hub from nothing. The next question, still unfolding, is how to keep it relevant when the world it connects begins to fracture.